Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. This is Lubrizol's webinar on everything you need to know about antifreeze for fire sprinkler systems. Really appreciate your time this afternoon. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, we'll just introduce ourselves. My name is Lainey Leota, and I'm the Global Segment Manager for our fire protection brands, which are Blaze Master CPVC and Freeze Master Antifreeze. Our headquarters are in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm actually based out of Jonesboro, Arkansas for the time being. But I've been in the fire protection industry for about 12 years now. Started my career off in product management at Tyco, which became Johnson Controls. Went to Chemours for a little bit, and worked on refrigerants for about a year and a half, and then came to Lubrizol in this role and for various versions of it. So excited to be here today. And Paul, I'll let my colleague Paul introduce himself as well.
Well, thank you, Laney. My name is Paul Winstead, and I'm also with the Lubrizol Corporation, and I have been with Lubrizol for 14 years. Prior to coming to Lubrizol, I was a fire sprinkler contractor, and actually, February the 12th of 2026, it'll be 40 years for me. 40 years in the fire sprinkler industry, working with fire sprinkler contractors and on projects and general contractors and engineers. And I have to say, it's been a fantastic journey. I know I'm getting to the end of it, but you meet a lot of really great people, and it's a lot of fun. So Lainey, kick it off. We'll go talk about Freeze Master today. And maybe we're going to teach you some things you didn't know, and we'll see how it goes.
I hope we teach you some things that we didn't know. We want this to be kind of informal, a bit casual. We're not reading slides, right? I'm going to handle kind of the codes and standards portion of it, or what the specific listings are. And then how Paul and I do this is sort of tag team it. I've never installed or designed an antifreeze system or a sprinkler system in my life. So who am I to tell you guys how things work in the field, right? But I do sit on a lot of standards committees, codes committees, things like that. I'm involved in new product development, things like that. So I'll go over what I know, and then I'll switch it over to Paul for like a real life conversation about just tips that we've seen since a listed antifreeze has been launched. Sorry.
Exactly. And Laney, exactly, Laney. I'm gonna talk about the design, I'm gonna talk about the installation, I'm gonna talk about all the things I see that contractors are having issues with out in the field, and we'll see if we can't get some of that resolved today. So Laney.
Absolutely. And as Scott put in the chat, if you do have a question, we put you all on mute for now. At the end, we'll allow you to come off mute and ask questions. But if you have questions throughout, please put them in the question and answer box on Zoom, or the Q&A box, and not in the chat, so that we can see them and make sure that we address them. If we don't get to your question, or we don't know the answer to your question, we will follow up with you via email, or one of our Freeze Master reps will follow up with you after the webinar, and make sure that you get the information that you need. So we'll start with the background of listed antifreeze. As many people probably know, right in the early 2010s, or in the 2010s, there were some instances where an antifreeze in fire sprinkler systems actually injured and in some cases unfortunately killed people, because when a fire happened, the antifreeze actually contributed to the fire and caused explosions. They didn't know that up front, obviously, or they wouldn't have put it in the system. But what UL did some research, and NFPA took action and found that improperly mixed antifreeze was a detriment and a severe hazard to the functionality and the performance of the fire sprinkler system. And so NFPA made some TIAs and some changes to require listed antifreezes moving forward. And we'll go over what those changes are and what NFPA requirements are. But I think the best way to explain the dangers of a non-listed antifreeze, or kind of what we consider legacy antifreezes, and field mixed antifreezes, so antifreezes that aren't mixed in the factory according to precise mix and ratio. UL did some testing that I'm going to share with you, because there's no better way to explain it than to show you. So give me a moment here, and this lasts about, we won't watch the whole thing. I do encourage you to check out the entire webinar from 2020 that Carrie Bell gave from UL, but we'll watch the fire the fire performance part of it.
Of one of these legacy research tests that were conducted that I thought really did a nice job of illustrating the concern associated with the ignition and the high concentrations of these legacy antifreeze solutions. This particular test involved the discharge of a 60% solution of propylene glycol from a reservoir having a nominal K factor of 3.1 or 44 in metric units, and that was located 5 foot or 1.5 meters above the fire source. Now, the fire source was a rectangular pan of heptane, as you can see there. And we did that because we found out during the early research that was conducted by UL that the location of fire relative to the sprinkler was an important variable. Now, another important variable that we found during the earlier research was the pressure that was applied at the sprinkler. And so we started out during this fire exposure test at a very low pressure of around 10 psi or 70 kilopascals. And we intended to go up to 150 psi or over 1,000 kilopascals. But as you can see, we quickly observed ignition and substantial contribution of the antifreeze solution to the fire. So we actually terminated this test at around 80 psi or about 530 kilopascals. And what you see there is as we ramp up the pressure, we're getting more contribution of the antifreeze solution to the fire. And when we terminated this test, we were measuring over 10 megawatts with our calorimeter. So basically what this antifreeze solution did is turn this 500 kilowatt fire into a fire that was releasing more than 20 times the heat release rate of the standard fire that we were exposing it to. And you'll see here, once we terminate this test at around 80 psi, we'll stop the discharge of the antifreeze solution and the fire goes back to the standard 500 kilowatts. So that was a very revealing test indicating the potential for these solutions to actively contribute to the fire.
So I think that does a perfect job at demonstrating why listed antifreezes are required and why NFPA standards made the change to require listed antifreezes. As you saw, once the antifreeze was delivered to the fire, you saw, what most people would consider an explosion, right? That happened in a few instances in homes and apartments of people, which resulted in death and injuries. And that's something that, fire sprinkler systems are supposed to protect lives and property, certainly not harm them. So that's the background and sort of the importance of this topic. And so again, I encourage you to go to UL's website and watch the rest of those videos, or watch the rest of that webinar if you're interested in learning more about the background. So talking about what changes NFPA standards, what changes were made to NFPA standards in relation to antifreeze. We used to spend a lot of time on this section back in like 2020, 2021 timeframe, where different editions or there was a deadline for existing antifreezes to be replaced with listed antifreezes and things like that, and can spend minutes and minutes and minutes on this. However, I've summed it up into one slide because I think most people are pretty familiar with the standards now. So I summarized it here on the slide in one word, and it's into one slide. And it's basically that if it's a new system that you're dealing with, it has to be installed with a listed antifreeze. You should not be installing any type of new system with a non-listed product. There are very few exceptions in 13D, which likely don't apply to many people on this call, but if you do 13D work, please go look at that exceptions, and the freeze points on those non-listed products that are acceptable are very, very high. So they can only be used in certain parts of the country anyway. But a good rule of thumb that's going to address 95% of cases is if it's a new system, you must use a listed antifreeze. The legacy stuff cannot be used. Existing systems per NFPA 25 is where there's a little bit of more confusion, but it's still pretty straightforward. I mean, you should basically just say a listed antifreeze is required when existing or new systems, right? However, the 2014 and 2023 through 2023 editions of NFPA 25 gave a sunset date for existing systems to use a non-listed antifreeze. So now that we're past that sunset date, which happened in 2021, the rule now is existing systems, if you come across it in an antifreeze system and you don't know whether the product is what the product is, whether it's listed or not, it should be drained and refilled with a listed antifreeze or retrofitted with another freeze protection method. So converting it to a dry system using heat trace, installation, you know, whatever the appropriate method might be. So basically, you shouldn't have a non-listed antifreeze in an existing system. If you come across that, replace it with a listed antifreeze. Caveat, in the 2023 edition of NFPA 2025 or NFPA 25, and what will also be in the 2025 edition most likely, is there's language that permits the use of a listed antifreeze outside of its listing parameters if the temperature, the freeze protection is, you know, temperature is met, and only if it's replacing a non-listed solution. So what that means, and we'll talk about listing parameters lately and why that change was made, but it's still saying you have to use a listed solution. It's just you might not have to, there might be extenuating circumstances, like you have a significantly large volume system that there's no other option but to use a listed antifreeze outside of its listing limitations, things like that. It gives a little bit of flexibility for those very large existing systems out there to make it more cost effective and basically to just get the non-listed stuff out of there, because the thought is that using a listed solution is going to be safer than a field mixed non-listed solution. And so we'll talk a bit about that, but that is overall a summary. So today, as of November 7th at 1:14 p.m. Central, there are 4 listed antifreezes available on the markets by 3 manufacturers. Ours by Lubrizol is Freeze Master Antifreeze. Tyco and Johnson Controls have 2 antifreezes. They have LFP Antifreeze, which stands for Liquid Freeze Protection, and then LFP Antifreeze Plus, or LFP Plus. And then Noble, who most of you are likely familiar with, as they sold a lot of the legacy non-listed type solutions. They also have a listed solution called Firefighter Eliminator 1330. So when you're dealing with a listed product or a listed antifreeze, those are the only ones available on the market today. And then one thing that's really important to note is that just like, you know, it takes time to develop a sprinkler head or a valve or anything that's UL listed or third-party listed, it's much more complex than just you must meet this one test, right? So this antifreeze, the legacy antifreeze, did a great job at protecting the fire sprinkler systems from freezing. However, it didn't do a great job at actually suppressing the fire or containing the fire. And there's also concerns about electrical conductivity, about corrosion, things like that. So UL made a testing protocol that includes 16 different tests that a solution has to go through to in order to be listed. So it's not just freeze protection, right? The old stuff, because it wasn't listed, all you had to deal with is freeze protection. Now there's so much more that you have to consider. And I'm not going to read all of this, but this is all of the stuff that's involved in the UL protocol that manufacturers had to consider while formulating their recipe for antifreeze. And part of the reason it took so long for a listed antifreeze to come out, this stuff takes time, right? The testing doesn't only take time, but the R&D that goes into this and tweaking formulas takes a really long time. So this is the background as to why there are listing parameters. They wanted to make sure, as you heard Carrie say during that fire video, they found that the pressure of the sprinkler head had a lot to do with the effectiveness of the antifreeze and things like that. So that's just background as to why listings, why there's so much more in a listing than there was of just the old stuff that was just antifreeze, right? And so in UL protocol, what resulted in that is some new terms that might not have existed, or at least one did not exist in the legacy antifreeze. And one of those is minimum use temperature. So in the legacy non-listed antifreezes, you're familiar with freeze point, right? They all had a freeze point. But UL created a term called minimum use temperature, which is basically the freeze point plus an additional safety factor, right? It's not exactly 1 degree Fahrenheit. It can be 2. I think it is closer to 2 if you round up. But that's what minimum use temperature means, right? And then the freeze point, and this is a common misconception. The freeze point of the antifreeze is the temperature at which ice crystals begin to form. So if you look at it under a microscope, you start seeing ice crystals. When people hear freeze point, sometimes they think, oh, frozen solid, or that's when, water won't, or nothing will be able to make it through the pipe. That is not true. The freeze point is just, you wouldn't even see it with the naked eye. It's when ice crystals begin to form. What isn't required to be published, but at least FreezeMaster publishes, is the pour point and the burst point. So the pour point of a solution is pretty self-explanatory. It's the lowest temperature at which the antifreeze will remain pourable or flow, right? Not slushy, mix. And then the burst point is quite obvious. It's when the antifreeze will actually burst the vessel that it's in. So those four terms are very important to consider when selecting an antifreeze for a system. And then on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's other considerations that aren't temperature related. Compatibility is one of those. There was, with legacy solutions, there were certain issues with CPVC and antifreeze solutions, and with gaskets and antifreeze solutions, things like that. You all knew that, and so in their testing protocol, they included compatibility tests, and that's with basically everything that they could think of being in a sprinkler system, from elastomeric seal to types of metal to types of plastic, things like that. They're all included in the test. And then another thing that UL came out with as part of the listing parameters are listed on this slide, like system volume limitations, minimum design pressures, specific hydraulic calculations for the antifreeze or the water, expansion contractions, super important to account for, which we'll go into and Paul will get into in detail, and then just different installation and maintenance requirements. So if you take one thing away from this slide, it's pay attention to the listing parameters. Just like you wouldn't install a sprinkler head without reading the data sheet and looking at how it should be installed or where it should be installed, what the pressure requirements are. You shouldn't do that with any listed antifreeze, whether it's FreezeMaster or others. So these are the four most common differences among the antifreezes: minimum use temperature, system volume size, per application or occupancy, minimum design pressure, and then compatibility with piping types and other system materials, like I explained before. So those are the four most common critical differences that you should be looking for. This is a cheat sheet that compares all of them for you by brand. Minimum use temperature is 1. Tyco LFP has the coldest minimum use temperature. However, they have a 20 PSI minimum pressure requirement and are limited to 40 gallons in ordinary hazard. FreezeMaster, for example, is the only solution that is UL listed for galvanized piping systems. So there's all these considerations that you have to take into account when you're selecting an antifreeze. The NFPA 25 existing system rules allow you to consider, it's basically telling you that if you have an existing system that's maybe 600 gallons or 550 gallons or something like that, where no other solution exists, you can use a listed product outside of its listing parameters. They just wanted to give some flexibility and try and get the old stuff out of there. So this sheet is also listed on our website at freezemaster.com, but this is the overall comparison of all the solutions out there that are available. just one point is when you look at minimum use temperature, you have to look at the freeze point as well, burst point, etc. And NFPA has a chart in NFPA has a chart in their standard that show you the mean temperature where so that you can evaluate what freeze protection is required for where you live. But you also can't forget about conditioned spaces. And just because you might live in Alaska, for example, doesn't mean that you're going to be exposed to those extreme temperatures. Maybe a -12 freeze point or a -12 minimum use temperature would work for you if you're in a conditioned space. And then these are just types of common applications where we see antifreeze used. We don't encourage the use of antifreeze in new systems that are like 500,000 gallons or whatever, right? Antifreeze should be used in smaller, it can be used like that, but we recommend use in these types of areas. Where is Freeze Master available? It is available through Viking and Core in Maine here in the United States. If you're in Canada, you can get it through National Fire Equipment as well as Viking. And we'll be opening up other distributors soon. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul for the next 40 minutes to go over the good stuff.
Fantastic. Hey, Lane, if you don't mind, would you take me back to I like your slide 13. Yeah, that slide right there. And let's just talk about the applications for an antifreeze system. Laney described that, yeah, we want you to use Freeze Master, and, but when you start getting up into 500, 600, 700 gallon systems, that gets rather large. And so there's just some photos there of generally what we see. All my years in the fire sprinkler industry, and I've designed many antifreeze loops and systems and it's usually where you have a warehouse and they've put a lean-to or a loading dock on the side, and they're going to store boxes like you see in one of the photos there. And the fire marshal comes by and says, "Hey, you need sprinkler protection," and he called the sprinkler contractor. I go out there and I say, "Hey, okay, it's going to be $16,000-$17,000 for a dry system." And they look at you like, "Man, I can't afford that." And I said, "Okay, well, maybe $6,000-$7,000 and I can put you in an antifreeze loop." So hence, most antifreeze loops will be around 40, 50 gallons. And you're coming off a wet system inside of the building, looping down and catching some sprinkler heads out over a loading dock or something like that. But what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing fire sprinkler designers actually start using listed antifreezes in more applications, more maybe a little bit more complex system layouts. And so we need to talk about some of the things that I'm seeing with sprinkler contractors. So if Laney, you go ahead and move me back to where I was right there. Thank you. One thing about listed antifreezes, and this is by UL 2901. And the statement is this: requires antifreeze solutions to be pre-mixed at the manufacturing site, and they are not intended to be diluted or mixed in the field. So what is that? So in my day, we would install an antifreeze system. We would bring out a 55-gallon drum of propylene glycol. We'd have a 55-gallon drum of water. We'd have 5-gallon buckets. And we were what we would call a parking lot chemist. So depending on whether you were in Atlanta or Nashville or Louisville or Indianapolis or Detroit, you used the graft, and you would actually mix the propylene glycol and the water together there in the parking lot. You'd put some on your refractometer, you'd hold it up, and you would read the viscosity. Now, hence what we would do, knowing that people come into your system, come in and open valves and close valves when you're not there, they keep diluting the system. The more water you add back into the system, the more you dilute it. So you take it, say, from a -10 to a -5 to a 0 to a 5. And then the next thing you know, you're getting a phone call that the system is froze up. So as a fire sprinkler contractor, we had a tendency to mix them a little heavy, to mix them a little thick. All right. Just so when people did come through there and open up valves and and introduce water into the system. You know, we knew that we would actually have a concentration that would maybe absorb some of that. So, but what's changed? So what has changed? What has changed with these UL listed antifreezes is this right there in table A. Table A, and that right there come out of the Freeze Master Installation Manual, the Freeze Master Installation Manual. And I encourage each one of you to download it and read it. Read it at least once or twice, because there's a lot of good information in there. So if you look at table A, the acceptable property ranges of Freeze Master antifreeze for minimum use temperatures of -12. So right there, the concentration of Freeze Master antifreeze is 100%, not 99%, not 95%, not 90%, but 100%, 100%. Because, and it's got to read within that specific gravity of a 1.087 to a 1.093, or, and that's read with a hydrometer, or with the refractive index, where the refractometer, that index at 68 degrees Fahrenheit is a 1.390 between a 1.394. Now, I get calls from fire sprinkler contractors from their inspection departments that will tell me they have replaced a legacy antifreeze with Freeze Master, Tyco LFP, Tyco LFP Plus, Noble Eliminator, Firefighter Eliminator, and they're not getting those readings. The readings they're getting on the refractometer are saying less than a 1.39. They may be a 1.3. The closer you get to 1, the closer you get to the number 1, it's becoming water. Water is 1, okay? So the closer you get to 1, it's becoming water. Actually, outside of this refractive index or the specific gravity, as you get closer to 1, you're now out of the UL listing. As per all 4 manufacturers' installation instructions, you've got to dump it out on the ground and start all over. And you can imagine if you have a system that's 200, 300 gallons, that gets rather expensive. The chart there on the right, and I don't want to mislead you with that chart, but that chart is actually showing you different percentages coming from the refractive index as it's being diluted. So you're going from a -12 back to a -8. Now, what's misleading about that chart there on the right is anything out of the refractive index and the specific gravity is no longer a UL listed antifreeze. So this is where caution must be observed, is that you have to keep it 100%. So if you're a fire sprinkler contractor, you're probably looking at me going, how do I keep this thing 100%? People are always coming there and opening valves and closing valves. Exactly. If you go to the next chart for me, Laney, next slide, you know, these are some of the tools that you use. I have a refractometer. You know, they're a little expensive, but that you need them to do your job. And I also have a cylinder here with a hydrometer in there. The hydrometer is very cheap. You know, I bought it off of Amazon for like $20. You know what I'm saying? But I have to have a granular cylinder, and you fill your granular cylinder up with your listed antifreeze, and it'll float, and you'll get a reading from that. So while those are very tools that you need, those are all the tools that you need to be able to test your system. And you have to test your system so you know where you're at on your specific gravity and your refractive index. Next slide, Darlene.
One thing that I want to mention specifically on this slide is there's installation in the installation instructions, and also in the standards, it says that you need to completely flush the system, and there's reference to draining drops, right? In the 2026 edition of NFPA 25, there's going to be language in the annex that provides a little bit more direction around when drops should be drained and when they shouldn't. And or not when they shouldn't, right? Ideally, if you guys have time, we would love for you to drain every single drop, but we realize, or UL and NFPA manufacturers realize it is not practical. So the rule of thumb is drops over 36 inches should likely be drained if there's evidence that high concentrations of antifreeze has collected in the drop. So if you can't get your system to test within spec, or if you're seeing issues, that's likely evidence that there's some contamination in the system. So that's one thing I wanted to clarify, because we get that question all of the time. Please reference the annex language in NFPA 25 for the specific language. And I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Give me the next slide, Lainey. So yeah, it's right. It's very critical that you drain and flush the system, especially the low points. Considering it, like Lainey said, over 36 inches. So, as a contractor, I'm going to explain it to you. If you're a fire sprinkler contractor and you have had an existing system, that had it was a propylene glycol water, it was a glycerin and water system. I can't tell you how important it is to drain the system completely. Again, if you're a fire sprinkler contractor, reading the instructions, you will know how to price. You will know how to price converting a legacy antifreeze system to a UL listed antifreeze system, because you have to consider you're going to have low points. You're going to have low points. You're going to have trapped water in your systems from time to time. You've got to get that out. If you don't get that out, and you have just pumped 40 gallons of Freeze Master into this system, and you start pulling samples, and it doesn't read into the refractive index, it's less, then you're going to have to dump it all on the ground and start back over again. It's very important to prep the pipe, get the pipe prepped, the existing pipe prepped for the new listed antifreeze. And regardless whether it's Freeze Master, Tyco LP, or Noble, they're all going to read the same. There's no difference between any of them. Go ahead, Lainey. Now, one thing you can do, and I talk to sprinkler contractors about this a lot, especially on new systems. On new systems, you've installed a new system. Now you need to hydrostatically test the system. You can hydro test as per NFPA 13, as per the Freeze Master installation manual. You can hydrostatically test against the Freeze Master. You do not have to drain it out and fill it back full of water. I'm just going to a true life story. I had a sprinkler contractor do the exact thing. He used Freeze Master. He filled the system up in April, and then we were talking. He actually drained it out in November. He filled it full of water. He hydrostatically tested it. He drained the water out. He filled the system back full of Freeze Master, and it wasn't within, and it did not read. It read less than the specific refractive index. You had trapped pipe. So you had trapped pipe with trapped water. So again, now you're in a situation. You've got to drain it all out. You've got to get the water out of it, and now you fill it back up, which is costing money. One thing that's fairly important that's totally different than our old antifreezes, our old legacy antifreezes. You basically were calculating the system just no different than you would hydraulically calculate the system using the Hayes and Williams for friction loss. All right. And for steel pipe, it's 120, and for Blaze Master, it'd be 150. All right. So, but what's changed with this new UL listed is now you're actually having to use the Darcy-Weinbach friction loss formula. Okay. And you've got to calculate both. The instructions for all four tell you have to calculate using both. So the Hayes and Williams is for calculating water in a pipe. The Darcy-Weinbach is for calculating a fluid that changes in viscosity as it deals with water temperature. So I think of it like this. I think of it pretty much like maple syrup. If you had maple syrup in a pipe, you know what I'm saying, and it was cold, it'd be very thick. If it was warm, then it'd be very thin. So that's basically what you're doing there with the Darcy Weiss block, is that you're using that friction loss is for the fluid that is going to change the viscosity due to temperature, and then the Hayes and Williams is for water. Okay, you also have to account for the viscosity of the antifreeze at the lowest anticipated temperature. You have to adjust the K factor of the sprinkler head to account for the antifreeze density. This is all in the installation instructions. Where I'm seeing problems, whether it be from California to Nevada, across the United States, South Carolina, North Carolina, I'm asking the question. Yes, you have a listed antifreeze that's -12. Okay, -12. But when you go to calculate, when you're calculating, I think sometimes the designers are not taking into consideration the high temperature, the upper temperature, the 150 degrees, the 160 degrees. Because what we're seeing there is, and when you look at the installation guide, talking about temperature change, and I'm just saying, and I have it here in front of me. So I'm looking at a 50-gallon system. And if I go all the way over to 160 degrees, that system is going to expand. It's going to expand by 2.7 gallons. It's going to expand by 2.7 gallons. If I drop down to a 200-gallon system, and I go over to 160 degrees, that system will expand 10.7 gallons. 10.7, that's huge. That's big. Generally, Laney, go to the next slide. I think that's where I get into, right here we go. So if you look at, this is as NFPA 13, Chapter 8. In our check valve, we always drilled a 1/32 hole in the clapper. And that 1/32 hole would allow for expansion and contraction. You know what I'm saying? It would allow for expansion and contraction. You can't have, you see, with a listed antifreeze, you can no longer have that check valve. You got to take that check valve's got to be removed. You can't have that 1/32 hole clapper in there, okay? Because you're going to dilute the system. It's going to dilute the listed antifreeze. And so the next time you go in there to pull it, test it, you're going to be out of spat. You're going to be out. It's not going to read within the refractive index or the specific gravity. So what we recommend there is now using an expansion chamber, an expansion tank. Okay. So what I'm seeing on a lot of existing systems where the legacy antifreeze has been removed and the sprinkler contractor is installing a UL listed antifreeze, they're coming back 3 or 4 months, 6 months later and say, hey, especially on a threaded system, they're saying it's starting to drip between the sprinkler head and the 1/2 RC. It's starting to drip. We're starting to see drips between the male threads and the female threads on the fittings. And so when they start putting tattletale gauges back on these systems, we're seeing these systems peg out at 350, 370 psi. Now, the maximum for a fire sprinkler system is 175 psi. So with these tattletale gauges, we're definitely learning you have to go back and recalculate the expansion chambers. So we recommend the NFPA 13 8.6.3.3 when we're talking about with the backflow preventer and the expansion tank arrangement for the antifreeze systems. Go ahead, Lainey. So with that being said, there's a company out there, and there's many companies that make expansion tanks, expansion chambers. One company is Amtro. Amtro, if you go to Amtro's website, they have a calculator. That has all of the data, the coefficients for Freeze Master, Tyco LP, Tyco LP Plus, and Noble Firefighter Limited. They're already figured in there. They're already there. It's a drop down. You pick Freeze Master. I'm using Freeze Master. You answer the questions. And I challenge designers, make sure you get that high number correct. Get the high number. Don't cut it off at 120. You take it all the way up to 150. There's not going to be that big of a difference in the model change, if there is a model change in the expansion tank. Okay, I even go back and add 10%. All right, to it. But they have a calculator there that will size the expansion tank for you. That's the formula over there for size and expansion tank above that photo. And I think I would just rather let AMTRO do it. They have a pretty good calculator on their site that will do all that work for you. But I am seeing a lot of this, whether it be from California, Nevada, clear across the United States, from sprinkler contractors. Especially when they have gone in there and they've removed a legacy antifreeze and they've now filled it with a UL listed antifreeze. They're starting to say, hey, this stuff is dripping, it's dripping. I said, well, I get to asking questions, is it, especially out like in Nevada, they'll say, well, yeah, it gets to it's 100 and 110, 115 during the day, and it drops down to 30, 40 degrees at night. So they're having a lot of expansion and contraction going on. So just something to keep in mind. Go ahead, Lainey. Something else that's come up, and we in our installation manual, we call out the system shall be outfitted with air vent valves and fluid sampling valve connections as required by the applicable NFPA standard. Now, again, air expands much more than water when it's heated. So you've already taken out the check valve that had the hole drilled in the clapper. Okay, so now you've really tightened the system up. You may be but you've got a fluid that's going to expand and contract based upon heat and temperature, or the temperature and the volume. So you've got trapped air. You've got trapped air in that system. So not only are you going to have this fluid that's going to expand when it gets hot, now you're going to have the air that's going to expand as it heats up. So you really got a lot of pressure pushing back on that. So those are just, Potter, Langsdale. They all make valves, air vents to put on your system to get that air out. So that maybe would keep those gauges from pegging. Go ahead, Lainey. Again, the refractometer must have your refractometer must have a RL scale covering a range of 1.3 to 1.5. We want you to do not use the Brex, the Glycom, or the glycerin scales. Use the RI scale. You got to keep it clean. Keep your device dry. These things are very expensive, so you want to take care of them. The diagram there is basically showing light. It's showing light hitting a fluid with viscosity, and it bends the light. And so how the RI, the refractive index, how that reading has occurred is by those angles. It's measured those angles. Trust me, that little computer in your hand can do it a whole lot faster than we can, or I can for sure. Go ahead, Lane. So, practical field tips. Always read and follow the installation instructions. I have found that when you do read the installation instructions, the installation goes much better, especially the end result. And that's what you're looking for. Use the Hayes and Williams for the water and the Darcy Weinbeck for the antifreeze. We recommend using expansion tanks instead of check valves with a hole for the account for the expansion. That's just not going to work with this fluid. Account for the upper temperature when sizing the expansion tank. I think, look, that negative 12, okay, that negative 12, that negative 15, that negative 20, whichever listed antifreeze you're using, that is preset. That's preset. That's that would be like me, like I said earlier, like me being a parking lot chemist, mixing this stuff in the parking lot. This stuff has been done in the factory. It's been done in a factory for negative 12. It's been set there. That can't be changed. Okay, it won't be changed if you add water to it, but it can't be changed if you keep it 100%. But what can change though is that upper temperature. You see, that's one thing people forget is about that upper temperature when it's hot in the summertime, when that pipe is up against a uninsulated metal deck, and that water starts to expand within that pipe. account for trapped air. I'm finding that trapped air is also adding to the problem. We need to be able to get the air out of there. Probably drain and flush the existing antifreeze system. Ensure low point drains are drained, and don't leave trapped water. Calibrate your refractometer correctly. Now, one thing I'm also going to tell you, and I'm going to contradict our installation guide, but I want you to know this. When you buy 4 5-gallon pails of Freeze Master, it gets delivered to you. It's sitting in the shop. You take it out to the job site. I want you before you pump that first gallon into that antifreeze system, I want you to check every 5-gallon pail for its calibration, that it is in the refractive index reading. Because the last thing you want to do is to put in say 35 gallons, and then that last 5 gallons be contaminated, and you get to dump it all back out on the floor again and start all over. Please guys, check this stuff in the containers before you put it into the system. Hey, people make, there's mistakes made all the time. You just don't want it to be a mistake on your job that could cost you money. All right, go ahead, Lainey. All right.
So before we get to the end, we did have a question come in that was saying, can we get a little deeper on annual testing and specifically how to test? So I guess we didn't get into that. Sorry, I'm trying to get that.
Sure.
Paul, could you go over?
Yeah. Okay.
that?
So fluid testing. Now, fluid testing. Okay. And I'm reading, and I'm going right from the Freeze Master installation manual. Okay, and it's page 5 of the installation manual called the fluid test. So now you may have a system. You may dealing with an insurance company or an underwriter or a fire marshal or internal the company, whatever, that may require your system be tested quarterly, semi-annually, annually. But in our installation manual, we say at least once a year, an inspection test and maintenance service shall take a measurement of a specific gravity or refractive index of the Freeze Master antifreeze system. Now, we're going to tell you you need to take it based upon the gallons of the system. And this is a little bit of a common sense. If you have a smaller system, you don't need to pull it from as many places. If you have a large system, you may have to pull it from a few more places. Okay, but you may have to put in valves. You may have to put mechanical tees in with valves so you can have sampling areas. Okay, if I had a 40-gallon system, all right, I know, and I can look at that system because it's exposed. All right, I know I could probably pretty much take a sample from the auxiliary drain or from the inspector's test, okay, for that type of system, and see if it's within calibration, okay, or it's within the refractive index. But if I've got a system that's 100 gallons, 200 gallons, 300 gallons, and I can't see the pipe because it's concealed, I know pretty much I'm probably going to have 3, 4 areas in the system where I can pull samples from to make sure that it's within the refractive index. Okay, so again, that is the testing procedure, and it says and it talks about in our installation manual 2 test methods are accepted per NFPA 25, and either may be used to verify the antifreeze within its specific limits, and we just talked about those: specific gravity and refractive index. Lainey, is that good, or should I go a little deeper?
I think that should be good.
Okay.
If there's more questions or clarification needed around that, please put more in the Q&A or in the chat.
Yeah, every fire sprinkler system, and I've been doing this a long time, and I've designed a lot of systems. And trust me, there's no 2 that are the same. a lot of, if you're a fire sprinkler contractor, you've got to use some common sense that, hey, this is a big system here. This is a big system. I can't see a lot of this pipe. I'm gonna have to put in some ports here that I can drain, where I can get some fluid and test this stuff. Nobody wants my biggest fear as a fire sprinkler contractor was when you knew it got down really cold at night. I'm talking about like -10, -12, -15 degrees. Man, you didn't sleep good that night because you just knew somebody was going to be calling you, say, hey, man, we've got water everywhere. So again, I would put in valves, so I knew I could pull this out and test it. Go ahead, Laney. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ramble there.
That's okay.
Reminiscing.
So next question. So again, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A, not the chat. The chat is disabled at the moment, so put them in the Q&A, please. One question that they have is, do you have to test at 68 degrees Fahrenheit? Like, for example, if you're in Las Vegas and it's 110 outside, how do you test?
Well, that is, and I've asked chemists this question. Okay, that is pretty much what the gauge has been, what your device has been calibrated at. Okay, so you'd want the fluid kind of at the same temperature as your calibrated device. I wouldn't want, to be honest with you, Laney, I wouldn't want to test 30-degree water. I wouldn't want to test 90-degree water. Okay, as long as you're close in that 68 degrees, you know what I'm saying? Ambient temperature water. Okay, does that make sense? I can't nail it down to exactly 68 degrees. I know Tyco and Noble, I think theirs is at 70. I think they have a totally different reading on there. So pretty much of ambient temperature water. I know, hey Lane, I know everybody on this today does exactly what I do. I come in my home where I live, I open up the cold water and I let it run, and I've got a thermometer, and I stick my thermometer underneath my cold water in my home. So I always know what my cold water temperature is. I'm sure you do that at your house as well, right? You don't? Okay. Well, maybe you're not as obsessed as I am about knowing what the temperature of my water is. So, yeah. So, but I was going to say, mine comes out right at 71, 72 degrees. So.
Great. Another question is there's a few questions in regards to disposal. I can cover some of that. Paul has said a few times dumping on the ground. We do not recommend that you dump the antifreeze on the ground. And you guys aren't going to like this answer, but it is basically up to your local, the local authorities and what they say. It is, classified as non-hazardous and non-toxic. But we've had some areas where they work out a deal with, a auto shop down the road and recycling it there. There are some areas that let you pour it down the drain. It just kind of depends on where you work. It's not food grade though. I can say that it is not food grade, but it is classified as non-toxic and not hazardous.
Hey, lady, on page 6 of our installation manual, the last column talks about disposal. Any disposal of freeze mass or antifreeze shall conform with all federal, state, and local waste regulations. So again, yes, when I say pour it on the ground,
You're being facetious. Yes, I get
it. There you go. That's the word for it. I'm being Southern. Yeah, you're pour it on the ground. You know what I'm saying? So, but no, you should not. If you're in LA or Chicago or New York or somewhere like that, I would not just pour it on the ground. I would check with my local people.
Pour it on the ground. It's going to very slippery.
Yeah, there's a guy in Atlanta that said you could just pour this stuff on the ground. What's his name and what's his phone number?
That's not the Lubrizol endorsed statement.
Right, exactly.
So a couple questions around backflow.
Yes.
Do you need backflow or do you see any requirements for an RPZ?
Yes, I've done a lot of antifreeze systems in Memphis, Tennessee, and in Memphis, Tennessee, they require an RPZ. They don't want any. They don't want any. They did not want any propylene glycol. They didn't want no glycerin having an opportunity to get back into the domestic water. So yes, check with your cross connection people, your water departments and stuff like that, or your yeah, because they may require an RPZ. But there's not, yeah, you can use an RPZ basically has an air gap. So if you have a discharge, it will, it just dump out into a container.
But with that, we'd like to say thank you very much for joining us.